Okay, this is the June 13 meeting of the VMware SIG under the Kubernetes project. I'm Steve Long, co-chair with Fabio, who can't be here today, but Andrew Kutz is standing in to cover active project updates. The community updates we've got, in the notes, you'll see a couple of links to VMware SIG sessions that occurred in the last few weeks at KubeCon Europe. There was a presentation that I did with David on using the new CSI driver. The link, if you go to the first link underneath it, you'll find the deck and the YouTube video recording. We covered configuration, installation, troubleshooting. So I'd highly recommend that if anybody here is new to attempting to use the CSI storage driver. Also in that presentation was a summary of the current state and the roadmap. There was another presentation on the cluster API used for deploying Kubernetes on top of vSphere infrastructure, and the link is there. I wasn't able to actually attend that session, so I don't know further details, but I know the speakers and I'm sure it was a good session. We've got KubeCon China coming up. I'm leaving for it at the end of next week. And there will be a SIG session there. The link is in the notes. There's a possibility that the next meeting of this SIG will be canceled because both myself and Fabio, the other co-chair, will be traveling back from China at that time. So I think I'm on an airplane. And I don't think I'll be able to join the meeting at the regular time. So if we decide to cancel, we'll post that on Slack in the mailing list. Speaking of Slack, a wrap up since our last meeting, there were a few support requests that were resolved entirely within Slack, and one is a pending issue under GitHub against the CSI driver. I think the last I looked at that, it was unclear what provoked the issue that the user had, and there was a request to get more logs. So it's still open. Also on Slack, there was a link to a good blog on using the Cloud Init tool that's built into many Linux distros. This is a built-in tool for doing a day zero OS setup, including installing packages, and Miles documented how you can use that to stand up Kubernetes on vSphere within a Linux VM. Speaking of Miles Gray, a major doc upgrade was merged May 30th, covering use of vSphere storage, and it looks really good. He doesn't seem to be here, but if you're watching the recording, thanks a lot, Miles. Other activity longer term, meaning by the end of the year, the Kubernetes Steering Committee is trying to reduce SIG sprawl. And one of the plans to address that is to fold the cloud provider SIGs into working groups underneath the cloud provider SIG. So by year end, this SIG is likely to no longer be a SIG. We will still have meetings, but they will be working group meetings. And the working group underneath the cloud provider will be primarily for a developer audience. The steering committee has suggested that it may be appropriate to also commission or inaugurate user group SIGs or working groups. And we're planning to attempt to compose one of these user groups for VMware users. That would be people using all forms of Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure. As I read the requirements for doing that, that's going to require identifying 4 users who are willing to go and document their interest in the Kubernetes project inaugurating such a user group. These people don't have to make a commitment to run meetings every couple weeks. It would be nice if they showed up to some or most of them, but you know, telling the CNCF or giving them a yes vote on composing this user group isn't necessarily a big time commitment, but we will want to identify for people representing users of Kubernetes on VMware infrastructure. So anybody on this call or watching the video who might be a user yourself or know of some users, I'd appreciate hearing about that, because I'd like to get that. I'd like to get the user group commissioned in time for KubeCon North America in November. In order to have it fully working by then, we're going to have to get on this probably by mid-July. So if anybody can help me out with suggestions of names or volunteers from users on watching this video, please contact me. You can contact me on Slack or the mailing list. Thanks. With that said, Ed, I'm going to switch this over to cover active projects. Andrew, are you ready to talk about those?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Steve. Let me switch to yours. I guess you're not sharing your screen. Let me share Safari. Oh, you're disabled. I can just read it off the meeting notes. I was just going to have them on the screen. But for those of you who don't have the meeting notes up, the active projects that we will be covering today are the Cloud Controller Manager, the Cluster API Provider for vSphere, and the Container Storage Interface Driver for vSphere, also known as CSI. Okay. So the Cloud Controller Manager, the out-of-tree vSphere Cloud Provider V020 was released, and while the project is now considered in beta, there are still a couple of outstanding issues before I think we would want people to use it in production. For example, there is incomplete IPv6 support, and Andrew Kim, if he was here, he has another meeting, could speak more directly to that. I think it has to do with the node address discovery. And also, he and I have talked a little bit about this because as it relates to CAPV, the Cluster API Provider, the CCM, Cloud Controller Manager, doesn't yet have, it's not necessarily a subset, but doesn't yet have feature parity with the in-tree cloud provider. And that will relate to the CSI project. In fact, let's just move to the CSI project next, and I'll do the cluster project last, because Cloud Controller Manager and CSI are linked. I don't know if it was covered in a previous meeting. I'm sure it was, but the CSI driver, it's no longer, or it's now, Travis, actually, you could probably speak to this better. I don't know how we're phrasing it, but it's no longer tied as directly to the Cloud Controller Manager in terms of repository management or build management, correct?
Yeah, we did split those repos into two so they can be managed and released independently.
Great, thank you.
Which was a major win for us. Much better.
Great job, everyone involved with that. So the CSI driver had a alpha release at V020, and another release is expected by the end of June. And for those not aware, it's being resourced now by the storage group at VMware, with the release after that being expected between now and the end of Q3. So unfortunately, I'm not sure which one of the, I think it's perhaps the June release that will help the CCM, but I'm going to ask Andrew or Fabio when they're available to maybe add that to the notes, because that wasn't something I was able to gather prior to this call. I apologize. Finally, the Cluster API Provider for vSphere, known as CAPV. Wow, we just like these 020 releases. This 020 was released March 29th. And I know it's kind of been on a kind of low-key momentum since then. So I actually am now the steward of that project, at least from VMware's point of view. And there are others working on it as well. Andrew Kim, whom I mentioned, who is related to CCM, is also working on that. And there's a lot of momentum and effort behind that. A lot of time and resources being devoted by VMware to achieve feature parity with the Cluster API Provider for AWS, known as Kappa. This will be, the feature parity release will be the next milestone release, and I will be updating the GitHub milestones and roadmaps to reflect that. And this is going to still be based on V1 Alpha 1. And this will allow for compatibility with things like the cluster upgrade tool, since we will now be in a position to stay lockstep with Kappa And for those unaware, why do I keep saying Kappa? A large part of the cluster lifecycle community works on that drive the spec with other community members or work on Kappa. So it's the project that gets a lot of the implementations first. And so once this feature parity effort is complete, we'll be in a much better place to keep up with all of the latest and greatest additions to CAPI, as well as the move to V1 Alpha 2 when that occurs. And that's the active project update. If anyone has any questions, now would be a great time. Steve, I noticed Miles showed up, so maybe we could circle back if he has anything to say about the blog after this.
Okay, I don't hear anybody with questions. Miles, we gave you a shout out for your blog post and the improvement of the docs. And one thing that did come up earlier in the meeting is that by the end of the year, this SIG is going to end up as a working group underneath the cloud provider SIG. But we also would like to propose to the Kubernetes Steering Committee that a VMware user group be created. We'll likely need chairs or leads of that user group if you might be interested, but we also need 4 actual users who would indicate their desire to have such a user group commissioned. So I'm reaching out to anybody who might be in contact with people using Kubernetes on top of vSphere infrastructure. Now, in my mind, this isn't necessarily just enterprise end users, but it could also be people with other distros, for example, OpenShift, who are attempting to land their distro on top of vSphere infrastructure. So those sorts of people might be interested in a place to bring together discussions of using Kubernetes on top of the vSphere hypervisor.
Sure, I'm pretty sure I could round up some customers, and I'm sure Michael has some customers that would probably be interested in this from his time in the field too. So yeah, that sounds like a great idea, actually. If you're looking for chairs, I'm happy to contribute some effort there as well.
Okay, and as far as the customers go, I discussed it with some members of the cloud provider SIG and steering committee members, and we're not asking the customers to sign up to be there as every 2 weeks to host a meeting or anything. It would be nice if they can come for most or half of the meetings, but it isn't an obligation. It really would just be an indication that they want such a user group to be composed.
Yeah, I think maybe it would make sense, obviously from an OpenShift point of view, but Google Anthos as well have expressed quite a lot of interest in our provider as of late too. So maybe we could get some people that are involved in those efforts to come along for the ride.
Yeah, I think almost all the Kubernetes distros that support on-prem installation support such an on-prem installation on top of vSphere. So I'd love to see a mix of distro people plus actual enterprise end users.
Okay, yeah, maybe we can come up with a list to propose people to. I can send out some feelers with customers that I've interacted with and see if any of them are interested in becoming part of that effort.
Another thing comes to mind, the CFPs for KubeCon North America are open now until mid-July. And if anybody's got any ideas for, it's likely that this will no longer be a SIG, but we should have the opportunity to get a session under the auspices of the replacement working group. So the recent guidelines on KubeCons are that they don't want you to repeat sessions from one KubeCon to the next because people can watch the places regardless of where they occurred. They can watch that presentation on YouTube. So if anybody in this meeting or watching the video has any ideas for something that might be appropriate to put on under the auspices of the VMware SIG/working group, please let me know, or just start an open discussion of this in Slack or on the mailing list.
I'm wondering if there's been a session on using cat-v to deploy clusters, or if that's just too basic.
Well, I think that the cluster API already has its SIG cluster lifecycle, and there have been multiple sessions on that subject at all the KubeCons, but that's been something that SIG cluster lifecycle claims ownership of.
Okay, fair enough.
And then at Europe, we actually had a presentation on cluster API. So, I think that arguably is covered, but maybe it will be time for a refresh if we refactor that to get it more closely aligned with the AWS cluster API. Maybe that certainly does sound like an idea.
Is it a bit vendory to maybe suggest a session on the upcoming CNS project?
No, I don't think so. We had one on the way to word it, I think, isn't on CNS, but to say it's on the upcoming CSI driver. And we already had one on the CSI driver in Europe, but it was on the version pre-CNS. So I think that totally would be within scope.
Do you know what are the dates for KubeCon North America?
It's the third week in November. So it might not mean anything to you, but there's a major US holiday called Thanksgiving, and it's the week before that. And it's in San Diego. So that's when it occurs. And the CFPs are open now until mid-July. I can't remember the exact date, but I think it's the Friday they're due midnight Pacific Coast time, Friday of the second week of July. And if anybody wants to submit on one of these topics, I'd be happy to work with you on putting together that CFP. Now, technically, these CFPs for working groups and SIGs go in under a different process. So it would require Fabio or I to go put in the submission, but that doesn't mean that we have to be one of the speakers. But that's the way it's worked in the past. And I actually haven't received the link from the CNCF for doing that. So, but I'd expect it any day now. There is, by the way, well, I guess I shouldn't bring it up because it's an internal meeting, but I'll get in touch with you after on what I was about to say. Sure. Does anybody else have any topics to bring up or questions?
I was just reading through the notes because I joined late. I noticed that the documentation effort was entirely attributed to me. That's not exactly true. Andrew Kim had a lot to do with that as well. So
okay, let me edit that and put his name in there. Okay, it sounds like there's no further questions, so I think we'll end this meeting early today. Oh, another thing, Miles, that you missed. It's possible that the next meeting in 2 weeks will be canceled, and the reason is that KubeCon China is that week. And I know I personally am going to be on an airplane flying back during the normal meeting time. I haven't talked to Fabio about his travel plans, so maybe he will be available to host a meeting, but there's a possibility that we're going to call that one off.
Understood.
If we do, we'll put out notice in the mailing list in Slack.
Steve?
Yes?
There's just one tiny update that I would like to give on a storage bug that we discovered for the entry provider.
Okay.
I know it's deprecated, but it's a bug, so it's likely to be fixed in, what is it, 15 or 16? 15 is already frozen. I don't know about the timeline. Which is about the zone storage topology handling in the storage classes, and this is where we discovered a bug. And this fix, which should land soon. So yesterday we had a demo run through, and we're discussing the code changes. This will make the entry cloud provider behave like the public cloud providers using storage classes with topology where volume scaling. Well, that was a complicated sentence. So it's basically a bug fix that then I think will be accepted for the deprecated entry provider.
Okay, and do you know, since it's entry, I imagine it's too late to meet the upcoming Kubernetes release, or do you think it's going to get in there?
Yeah, there was a discussion yesterday whether that would make it in there. There was no consensus on whether that's feasible or not. Likely it's not going to happen, but we might strive for backporting that fix into at least 13 or 14. So even though we might miss this window, hopefully we'll get it backported.
Okay, I'm just typing this into the notes.
Sure.
So you said this is going to make zone handling more closely aligned to behavior in public clouds. Is that a fair summary?
That's correct. Yes.
Okay, I've recorded that in the notes. Does anybody else have
Thank
any topics? Okay, then thanks for attending, and we'll put out word on whether the normally scheduled meeting in 2 weeks is going to occur or not. Bye.
Thanks, Steve.